Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I am, of course, your wonderful host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Petra Creamer. Petra, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This is super exciting.
Yeah, we are always stoked to do a new episode of the show. So, Petra, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm an assistant professor in the Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies Department at Emory University in Atlanta. I specialize in archaeology, obviously, but specifically archaeology of the area that's traditionally called the Ancient Near East, although we are moving towards as a discipline calling it Southwestern Asia and North Africa. I specifically focus in Mesopotamia, which is, of course, the land between two rivers. Mostly it's contained in modern day Iraq, a little bit of Syria, a little bit of Turkey. And that's where I've been working basically since I did grad school. I got my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in Philly, and I've been focused on it basically the whole time. I I run a project, an excavation project in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is a semi-autonomous part of Iraq in its north. And I'm starting up another field project in the ancient capital, the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh, which is in modern day Mosul. So that's kind of like me in a nutshell. I have a lot of interests. I specialize in Assyria. I specialize in ancient empires. So hopefully we can get into that.
Yeah, everything you just listed is like on every like archaeologist holiday dream trip, like Middle East, Asia, Iraq, Iran. Ooh, we are going interesting places here. So, we are talking about imperialism today, and this is just from a historical perspective that there are very, very few places in the world that haven't been touched by an empire of some sort. Would I be correct in saying that?
I think you're pretty much correct in saying that. If there are, I can't really think of examples, especially when we bring like more modern imperialism into play. Archaeologically, empires are really interesting to study. I'm biased, yes, but I think they're interesting to study because you start to see in the long-term perspective that archaeology is great for. You start to see how these like governing bodies, whether like forceful governing through military and politics, or whether kind of like indirect through economic pressures, how they affect all the people under their hegemony and what that means materially for what we end up digging up.
Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot of people, especially here in the United States, are thinking about, especially with the America 250 rolling around, how many people, like different empires, have actually set foot on this continent. We've had the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and, several other people I'm sure have been here that don't get any credit for invading.
Yeah. And it's kind of crazy too, because the American continents are such an interesting case study because in some case, in South America, there were already empires existing at the time of like Spanish Inquisition. Not Inquisition, maybe that's not the right word, but Spanish incursion into these areas. Obviously, the British and the French left deep impacts on the eastern coast, especially. So the historical archaeology of like modern, or what I'm going to call modern. Sorry, I specialize in stuff like 2 or 3 millennia ago. So everything past Jesus basically seems modern to me. But so like this historical archaeology of America is really a story of how empires affected the people that they came into contact with, not in the greatest ways in most cases.
No, if you want a really bad example of how imperialism works, just look at anywhere the Spanish decided to go.
It's true. It's
Not
not
to,
it's not it's not a delicate kind of governing. It's a very like forceful bring down the hammer on, indigenous populations kind of governing. And we see that in like the very ancient record too. And it's interesting to start studying empires from the very beginning because you see that this was kind of the playbook that was established by ancient states and then continued all the way into the modern era.
So, what constitutes an empire? What makes something, by definition, an empire?
Okay. So this is something I'm writing a book right now on like the real impacts of empire. Obviously, I'm using Assyria as my main example. The definition of empire is insanely difficult to nail down because there's so many versions of it. In general, the best way to define empire, I think, although I'm sure that, everyone, if everyone has an opinion, everyone's going to take issue with this. It is a state level society, if we're going to use anthropological terms, a state level society that rules over with some kind of force, whether political, economic, militaristic, a lot of cases, all three, other pre-existing polities that have been absorbed into this imperial polity. So obviously in my neck of the woods, in northern Iraq and Mesopotamia in general, that looks like the Assyrians taking over these pre-existing polities that existed in Turkey, in Syria, in modern day Israel, in Egypt at its very height. These were all separate governing states, sometimes kingdoms, sometimes city states. But once Assyria infiltrated this area and militaristically took over, they were absorbed into the Assyrian Empire and then became part of this imperial polity. This is true for basically, you know, most of history. And we even have like normal kingdoms and stuff that will do this too. The bridge, the line between large kingdom or large state and empire is a very amorphous, fuzzy one. And that's where a lot of the definitions kind of trip over themselves. Because is there a great way to distinguish between a kingdom which conquered other kingdoms around it and just decided to like rule over them? Or is it all dependent upon scale? Or is it dependent upon administration and bureaucracy? This is what can really be the picky part of the definition. I don't have a good solution. It depends on where in the world and when in the world you're studying.
Yeah, I agree. It's like a when in the world you're studying kind of question. Like everyone I talk to about this kind of topic, their go-to definition of an empire is using Rome at its height as an example,
And
because
that seems to make sense. Yeah, that is everybody's favorite, that's everybody's favorite empire.
yeah, because of one, the political scale of what they tried to maintain over the centuries, but also the amount of territory that Rome actually touched. Like it stretched all the way from Italy to what is now Great Britain.
Exactly. And all the way through my area too, right? Like it went all the way up to Mesopotamia and even a little bit into it. So it was huge. It was definitely Rome was definitely the largest polity the world had yet seen. It followed in the footsteps of a lot of empires before it. For example, some people consider Assyria the world's first empire because it ruled at a scale that nobody had ever seen before. But then, a century after it, the Achaemenid Persians also ruled at a scale that nobody had ever seen before. They definitely won up to Syria. And following this, Rome then took over as the one that had the most land to claim. And certainly, I think Rome is an interesting example and kind of unique in the sense that it was so embedded into a lot of the cultures that it ruled over that it's a different kind of governance than we see in Persia and Assyria. So even though the playbook kind of stays the same, the playbook of inserting local ruler, like either making local rulers vassals of the state or making these absorbed kingdoms and areas into provinces officially. Um, Overall, Rome was super interesting in the sense that the movement and the ability to move throughout its empire kind of gave it a leg up, I think, over Persia and Assyria, just in like technology sense, to be able to rule these areas.
And that's something we as archaeologists are incredibly interested in is the technology that spreads because of imperialism. Like just the metalwork of one group transferring to another. And we didn't actually have that in the United States, or what would have been the United States at the time,
Right.
until an empire actually landed here in the late 1400s, or depending on who you ask, before that, after that.
Right. And that was kind of like a shock to the system, I think, for the American continents. I mean, there had been metal working before, but it was mostly restricted to copper, and natural deposits of copper. So suddenly being exposed to fundamentally tools used for destroying and killing, unfortunately, with like guns, with flintlock pistols, it certainly, I don't really know. I'm obviously America is not my individual specialty, but just knowing from the areas I work in, it sometimes creates entirely new incentives to fall in line with empire when you get access to resources. A lot of people call this the buying in effect for empires. In a lot of cases, it's really difficult, right, to militaristically rule over all the groups, especially if you're a huge empire, right? All these groups, if you're just continuously only keeping them in line because you're a military force and you're threatening them, that's a lot of resources drawn off of your capital when you're an empire. It's also very unstable because no matter what, like you cannot keep eyes on everyone under your purview. No, like, especially if they're really far away. So there has to be a level of like incentive to be part of this empire for a lot of the groups. And in a lot of cases, this is access to resources, full stop. Different parts of Assyria willingly bought into the Assyrian Empire, and this is true of Persia and Rome too, because suddenly they facilitated a lot of trade routes that were not available to these people before. And with that came metals and technology and exchange of information, and in some cases, whole writing systems, in some cases, just pure access to like different routes that they had never seen before.
Okay, we're leaving out one very important reason that people trade, and that's spices. It's all
The
about
spices.
spices. Yes.
The spices, oh my God. And it's so funny to see how these routes develop from routes that were already existing because what in like the very early stages of Mesopotamia and the Near East, you see long distance trade both overland and by sea between Mesopotamia and specifically like the Indus River Valley in modern Pakistan and bordering India. And we don't know if it was necessarily for spices, but we do know it was for like gemstones. And this trade route became part of what is, the spice trade route, the Silk Road that connected China and Rome in later periods. Sometimes it was, called the Great Khorasan Road. It goes, kind of through the northern part of Mesopotamia and right under the Caspian Sea and goes into the mountains of Afghanistan. Um, and then, in later periods went all the way to China. So these routes were already well known. And sometimes it just takes power over these areas that contain the routes to become an empire and to suddenly exert military and economic pressure.
And that's why this is just from my personal perspective, I've always liked Istanbul as like a melting pot of imperial knowledge. Like on one side, it's got the Western influence of the European countries, and on the Eastern side, it has influences of Central Asian and East Asian cultures all like blending into one massive city.
Absolutely. And it's so fun to see it kind of in like modern architecture too, because Istanbul is still very much a city on the precipice of like both Asia and Europe and, you know, traditional culture and modern culture. So we can apply this kind of principle of Istanbul being a crossroad of empire and then later being a capital of its own empire when it was Constantinople. We can apply these kinds of modern ethnographic analogies to how ancient empires in general functioned. So it's pretty fun to see how some of this still survives.
Yeah, I mean, everybody loves, a visit from the Crusaders.
No
Who
comment.
who doesn't love the Inquisition showing up at their door?
Yeah, that sounds like a good time, right? Oh
So,
boy.
as archaeologists, what do we look for as far as lasting impacts of empires? I know that's a really loaded question.
It's a loaded question, and it's one I adore, right? Like, I am so close to finishing my book, so this is on the top of my mind basically 24/7. It's funny because one of the things I focus on is like the real impacts versus the ideal impacts. Obviously, when looking at history, we are there, the sources are biased towards those who produce these lasting documents, which is usually kings, their elite entourage, the administrators, right? So we are getting a very skewed perspective in history about what the effects of empire were, how effective different rules and laws and efforts were. Archaeology, of course, is the great equalizer, because we're actually digging up what really happened, right? We're digging up the lasting materials of empire. And in some cases, when you're looking at, material from the 99% of the subjects who were under Assyria, who were not the administrators, who were not in the palaces, right? Sometimes the effects are just not there. Sometimes, in our case, in for people who study Assyria and Persia, right, there's massive infrastructural projects to bring water to a lot of areas that don't have direct access to it, right? Always an issue in this part of the world. There's roads. The King's Road, which was started in Assyria and then kind of perfected by Persia, meant that you could travel. These were like paved roads and that had like little stations along the way. I like to call it in my classes the world's first Pony Express because that's kind of what it was. They had stations about a day's ride from each other where a messenger, if he was booking it to the other side of the empire, he could just get a quick meal, hop on a new fresh horse, and continue going, right? So these are huge, massive infrastructural achievements of these empires. And functionally, what it really enabled was, the transfer of armies and resources for armies. We can't really ignore that. Um, but when we get into, did Assyrian culture penetrate down to like the normal, person who's spinning wool in like the middle of the countryside in an area that's barely ever heard of the capital city? Not really. I mean, there's certainly effects. There's certainly higher taxes, but to some degree, there's more opportunities depending on where you are in the empire. So culturally, it's interesting to see what doesn't actually happen with everyone else under imperial rule. And then, in terms of like political impacts, sometimes, when the empire collapses, you see some aspects of the empire continue on. Like a lot of Assyria's playbook was copied immediately by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which came right after, and then the Persian Empire, which came right after the Neo-Babylonians. And some of it just immediately dissolved, right? Like we have some of the infrastructure was immediately abandoned. The Assyrian heartland, like the core part of Assyria, was depopulated effectively right after the empire fell. So things that probably the Assyrians thought would go on forever and were their biggest impacts, not so much in a lot of cases.
And I think it's the same when people look at the Hellenistic cultures, like Greece, it kind of fell apart, and then Rome picked it up where that ended, and then, Rome kind of shattered.
Rome shattered, but it is interesting to see just how much still remains materially and culturally today from it. I mean, to some degree, we can say that with like Assyria too. Obviously, the main languages in the area are still Semitic languages, which are directly descended from the language that Assyria spoke, which was Akkadian, and then also Aramaic. So clearly, there's like some linguistic continuity. Same with Rome, right? I mean, most of Western Europe speaks a Latin-derived language. That wasn't incidental. That was a direct effect of Rome.
But also at the same time, you made an interesting point, like how the everyday person would feel about it. Like, so Rome burns down. Wonder how long it actually took somebody in like what would have been France or Gaul at the time to actually hear about that after it happened. Like,
Yeah. And did
like,
it
hey,
make
buddy,
any difference?
so Rome kind of burned down a couple months ago, and we're like trying to start our own thing here. Would you like to get in on the ground floor of this?
Yeah, it's kind of like I imagine in a lot of empires, these people who are not in the imperial core and not directly affected by the collapse of these empires, it probably was like oh, huh, did you hear what happened the other day? Oh yeah, okay. So that explains why suddenly there's no nice Italian silk in the market. That makes sense. So it's like a cutting off of trade lines and communication. So I imagine once the next kingdom with a lot of power or an empire comes along, yeah, there's sometimes going to be terrible taxes, and hopefully you avoid most of the actual warfare and violence that goes with empires and imperial entities. But you could just sign on to be like, oh yeah, I want access to that silk again. Can you get me those trade routes? Can I see these spices in the market, please? Because it's been really annoying to not have that.
And then there are the people, well, this just came to mind. Like, what did your average person think when Genghis Khan died? They're like, huh. So old dude finally kicked it.
All right. I guess
Who's our
I'm
boss
wondering
now?
what's happening next. But
So which one of
fundamentally,
his
like, does this
numerous children is our boss now?
yeah. And it's fundamentally, does any of this matter beyond just like the amount of taxes I'm expected to pay on what I produce? Does it matter? Like, are my kids going to have to sign up for an imperial army? Like, are they going to be drafted in? These are all considerations. But this is not, there's no singular playbook for imperial entities. There's certainly playbooks that rhyme. Like, there's a reason that, one of my favorite things to say for my students is that Assyrian tactics from, the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age when Assyria existed, these are remarkably similar to what we see of the Incan Empire in South America, like over like 2 millennia later. And they certainly weren't in contact, right? These were not entities that were talking to each other, and the Inca were not like, oh yeah, Assyria did it that way, we can do it that way. These were developed separately in areas which have incredibly different environments, by the way, too, because people have found kind of constant universals to control people and to control areas that may or may not want to be under, imperial hegemony.
Yeah, this is something that I think about a lot, especially in terms of the American continents, is we came to the same conclusions that other people did without ever actually having contact with any of those people until they showed up here in the 13, 14, and 1500s and then
Yep.
decided not to leave.
The pickings were too good. Um,
We have a lot of
yeah.
shiny things on this continent.
And that's the thing, right? And this is something that I struggle with is that our empire is expanding for mostly economic reasons, or are they expanding mostly for militaristic reasons? And I kind of come down somewhere in the middle, right? In some cases, there's like a eat or be eaten mentality. When a polity is big enough, they start getting freaked out about other people on their borders getting powerful enough to be a threat, so they preemptively, or maybe not preemptively, just emptively, um, they go in and conquer these areas and people because they could have posed a threat, or is it just because they want access to more resources? These are not mutually exclusive, right? But it is interesting to kind of see chicken and the egg coming in here.
Yeah, somebody in Rome ultimately decided that the Teutoburg forest is nice this time of year.
Yeah. They were like, "Ooh, I like that timber. Sounds great." Also, these weird people, these Visigoths, man, they're kind of sketchy. We got to do something about them. And also get the timber.
Gotta build more boats or whatever it was they were using it for. I assume it was boats.
bad guess. I'm gonna say it. I mean, there's a reason Rome grew up on a peninsula.
And everybody keep in mind that these empires were built like before we had metal ships. Like everything they used to explore the world was made of wood.
Yep.
Part of
Sometimes
it,
even straw.
yeah, parts of it were metal, sure. Mostly wood.
It's kind of crazy to think about in a lot of ways. I mean,
Yeah,
just the massive amounts of infrastructure that went into these empires that were exclusively wood and stone. It's insane. I
like
always prefer when they're built in stone and mud brick. I'm gonna say because that's a lot easier to find. Wood usually tends to dissolve by the time we get around to excavating it.
yeah, and that's why we like our stone and metal artifacts because we can actually find them.
Yep.
The wood, not so much.
Not unless you're working in Egypt. They have an embarrassment of riches over there.
Oh, just the fun of working in Egypt. Like taking it like it's like a throwback to imperialism. Like this has been here forever.
I was going to say it's interesting to see how modern imperialism affects the archaeological process as well. And I say that as someone whose discipline has basically been founded on modern day imperialism. So luckily, we're kind of starting to move away from that. We've got a long way to go, though.
Well, I'm just thinking about, Napoleon's conquest, and he's probably the whitest dude to ever show up in Egypt.
Yeah, you have to wonder about the sunburn. The sunburn that must have resulted. I noticed that none of the paintings of him have him looking like a lobster.
Yeah. He like probably insisted that people get him from his good side while they faint. like the
That's the
half
imperial playbook, baby.
like the half cook side.
We're just going to turn away from that.
But yeah, and then there's, the modern examples of imperialism, not to get too modern, but the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure millions of people celebrated that.
I'm sure millions of people celebrated it. And it's interesting, too, on how being so divided behind the Iron Curtain and then the Western world, because Soviets were conducting also very good scientific archaeology at the same time we were during the Cold War. The difference is that we just never ended up talking to each other. And there's plenty of good scholarship that's published in Russian, especially on Central Asia, where Western people were not allowed to excavate because that was a Soviet area. Um, and a lot of it is still not being communicated just because there's a translation barrier and a scientific barrier that, we are multiple decades removed from the Soviet Union at this point, and it is still affecting modern scholarship.
This is one of my favorite examples of I think it's like a cheeky kind of imperialism. There was a statue of Vladimir Lenin. I think it's actually in Ukraine, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, they outlawed communist iconography, and now it is a statue of Darth Vader.
Are you kidding me? I have
No,
to
you
look
can
this up.
actually look that
Oh
up. It is
my
hilarious. I'm like, okay, so Lennon's out, Vader's in. Is there really a difference here?
Lennon's out, Space Empire's in. Definitely not too on the nose for evil empires or anything.
I'm like, is there really a difference without distinction here? Like, I imagine Vladimir Lenin walking into a room and it's Darth Vader's theme music.
I don't think he'd be the only one, quite frankly.
No, honestly, I kind of picture the same music playing whenever Stalin walked into a room.
I think there's a good I think there's a good healthy, tradition of kind of imagining pop culture evil empires with certain politicians right now. I think it makes a lot of sense.
But that's, another thing about imperialism. We can actually see the influences in pop culture from like empires that have been in the world.
I know that most people, of course, are more familiar with Rome, so they're taking a lot of their influence from like the Roman Empire. I'm not going to fault them for that. But man, if they want some really cool, like different cultural influences, I'm just saying Assyria started it all, right? I'm biased, of course, but it's kind of wild how both different and similar uh, the older empires compared to Rome like controlled their populations, and some of it's way more brutal. I'm gonna be frank, like one of the main claims to fame of Assyria right now in pop culture is the fact that they have wall reliefs upon wall reliefs of people being beheaded and piked and skinned alive. I'm not joking. These are things that are depicted. So they certainly drove the point home of the fact that they had violence that kept a lot of people in control. Was it overstated? This is what, we're still debating, right? It could have just been here, visitors to court, look upon everything that I can do to people. Don't rebel. I'm just saying, don't rebel.
Well, I mean, it's like a more English interpretation is putting somebody's head on a spike outside of the wall of your castle. I mean, like,
Oh yeah.
so this guy used to work for me, and this was last week that I put his head on that stick because he told a little too many jokes about his king. Can't have
I
that.
like the term going medieval on your ass, excuse my French. And it really does just fit across the violence of humanity fits across, you know, every bit of archaeology that we can find, unfortunately.
And that's something that the archaeology, I think, you don't actually get unless you look at the entire picture of an empire. Like, sure, the stuff is left behind, but you don't actually see the violence that's left behind with it. Like, unless you
Exactly.
actually read like a first-hand account of this empire, like you can't get the violence from like this little potsherd of an empire.
Yeah, and some archaeologists, I don't necessarily know if I'd call it lucky, I guess, in terms of understanding things it's lucky, but sometimes they do stumble across mass graves that can be connected with historical revolts or just, different battles and stuff, and that is like obviously an archaeological smoking gun. I'll fully admit, I tend to avoid areas that have like these grandiose imperial palaces and temples and everything. I do focus on these normal people because I'm way more interested. I'm so over hearing about kings and elites, and maybe I'm just sick of it for modern reasons too. But I am way more interested in what that random farmer is doing, in the summer of 678. I want to know why he's deciding to grow that much barley versus, spending all his resources on raising pigs.
Yeah, like that's something that people again are thinking about this year with the America 250. Like
Yep.
while the American Revolution was going on, but in 1783, the revolution, the war was over. We had to decide who we were going to be without British influence. And that, again, brings me back to the America 250. You're welcome, America 250.
I mean, it's a really interesting thing to see because, like I was talking about earlier, some things stay from empires and some things immediately dissolve. Like, there's no reason to keep around some of these imperial institutions if it doesn't serve you moving forward, especially if it was propped up exclusively by elites kind of twisting people's arms. When the elites are gone, like either deposed or, you know, dead in the ground, there's no real reason for, the farmers to continue maintaining, administrative storage areas, right? They just want to supply enough for them in their village. That's the way it's always been. They just don't have these external pressures anymore.
I think they were just happy that they no longer had British soldiers living in their house.
That too. Thank you to all the amendments that made that possible.
Yeah. Yeah, the last thing I want is some dude in a red coat living in my house.
I have learned to appreciate some of the amendments more and more as we move forward.
So, if people wanted to learn more about imperialism and archaeology, I know you said you had a book coming out. Are there
I
any?
do.
Yeah.
That's probably a couple years, in the future, just because I'm just now getting it to my publisher. So Academic publishing takes a long time.
Peer reviewing, love it.
Exactly. We got to go through the process, and it's a great process. Um, but overall, for people who are interested in empires, I would really recommend looking at some of the more popular books. Like you don't need to dive into like peer-reviewed articles immediately, right? You can take some of the easier to digest books on empires and just start realizing that you already probably know more than you've realized about how empires work. Recently, a book from on Assyria came out. It's very readable. It's meant for more of a popular audience. It's literally called Assyria, so pretty easy to find. And you know, for Rome, I'm not even going to get into it. There's about 1.5 billion things written on Rome. I'm sure people can find.
There's some great
So
movies on that one too. They're not
go
probably
figure.
historically accurate. Me personally, I like Russell Crowe and Gladiator. Probably not the most historical accurate. Gladiator
Had
2,
some beautiful cinematography though. Like I'm never gonna fault it for that.
Gladiator
Overall,
2
my
with its
advice on people finding stuff to work with is ignore the pop culture people who say that archaeologists don't want you to know, or like archaeologists or scientists are like flabbergasted or stunned, right? This is, I trust you. If we find this stuff, if we dig up this stuff, we want you to know. We want you to, if we found evidence for aliens, the public would know immediately. Like we would be so excited to tell you. Are you kidding me?
like there would be no stopping that information. Like let's be clear, if we as scientists, if we discover something we think is amazing, we will tell other people how amazing they should think it is.
Immediately. Yeah, like immediately out there. Do you know how much funding we would get? Do you know how bleak the funding landscape is right now? Of course we would be telling people. So all these people like Graham Hitchcock and stuff who are, big pop culture people, but they're like, I'm finding out what the real archaeology that archaeologists don't tell the public. It's like I can't even begin to enumerate the ways that you are wrong. So I like, do I want there to be a mythical society that built both the pyramids in Egypt and in Central America? No, but do I want to find it if it exists? Yes. Yes, I do.
It's a conspiracy by what we in the industry call big archaeology. We hide all the good stuff from the people.
I wish there was big archaeology. It would make getting funding a lot easier.
This program is not brought to you by big archaeology.
Yeah, put a little copyright, like a little disclaimer above the video right now. Asterisk, we are not sponsored by Big Archaeology.
I would love to be sponsored by big archaeology, though. Let's just be clear on that.
So
Oh,
my
we will.
ultimate take home with this, I tell my students this, please use your brains. Don't just tune out and look at pretty graphics and flashy things and, don't fall into the trap of, oh yeah, it's a secret. They're keeping it from us. No, nobody's keeping anything from you. We desperately want you to know everything we're doing. In fact, this is what we're fighting to do, is to try to get out to the public what we're doing.
We love the public.
We love the public.
Well, Petra, thank you so much for joining me. This is going to do it for us here on Archaeology After Dark. Again, it goes without saying, thank you for supporting all of our work. Again, the public, we are not big archaeology. So even your just shows of support, like just coming up to us, giving us a thumbs up or telling us we're doing a great job is good enough. Would we like you to write us checks? Oh yes, absolutely. But at the same time, we understand completely, or we want to understand completely.
We want to. We don't mind support in the form of funding.
Yeah, we would not be opposed to someone randomly handing us a briefcase full of money and telling us to go do science with it.
But in lieu of that, just tell your friends.
Yeah.
Tell your friends.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.